The next item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number S4M-05921 in the name of Anne McTaggart on the Mary-Barbour-Commemoration. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Anne McTaggart to open the debate. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am delighted, genuinely delighted, to be able to bring the campaign to recognise the achievements and legacy of Mary-Barbour before the Scottish Parliament this afternoon. I would like to thank members across the Chamber for their cross-party support and for joining me in calling for a statue to be dedicated to the memory of Mrs Barbour. The impact she had upon the lives of women, children and ordinary families in Govan is undeniable. To many of us who are unaware of the changes Mary-Barbour brought about for people all across Glasgow, some of which I hope will be recognised in contributions from members this afternoon. Mary Ruff was born into a working-class family in Kilbarchan in 1875 and later moved with her family to the village of Elderslie, before marrying David Barbour and settling in the Govan area of Glasgow, where she worked as a thread twister and carpet printer. As a working-class mother of 2 children in Govan, Mary-Barbour was well aware of the poverty and deprivation faced by ordinary people and, in particular, by women. These experiences led to her to take an active part in Scotland's first cooperative women's guild in the Kinnan Park Cooperative Society. This guild later became known for producing a generation of leading female politicians and activists, many of which played a crucial role in the establishment of women's housing associations throughout Glasgow and in the 1915 rent strike. It was during the 1915 rent strike that Mary became known for her effective local activism and encouraging political radicalisation of ordinary working people in Glasgow. Mrs Barbour recognised the need to organise women into a united resistance that would fight against underhanded rent increases being applied by unscrupulous landlords. In her efforts to challenge this injustice, Mary went on to form the South Govan Housing Association, which would later become known as the Mary-Barbour's Army. It was also these housing associations that brought about the end of the protests when they initiated one of Glasgow's biggest demonstrations on the 17th of November 1915. This mass demonstration, which included shipyard workers down in tools, was in response to 47 local campaigners being served with eviction notices. The protesters marching on the court shocked the establishment so much that they froze rents to pre-war levels. And this eventually led to the 1919 Housing and Town Planning Act. Mary-Barbour became Glasgow's first woman councillor in 1920. Throughout her 11 years as a councillor for Fairfield ward of Govan, she championed the needs of working-class women and children. She was instrumental in the establishment of public washhouses, laundries and baths. Perhaps most famously, Mary can be identified as a campaigner who brought about an initiative that supplied fresh milk to schoolchildren free of charge. She promoted the development of child welfare centres brought about by the establishment of home help for vulnerable people living alone, and championed the introduction of a pension scheme for mothers. Mary again broke new ground in 1924 when she became the first woman Baillie for the Glasgow Corporation. She used her time as Baillie to support the calls for birth control for women and chaired the Women's Welfare and Advisory Clinic, Glasgow's first family planning centre. Mary-Barbour retired from politics in 1931, having played a pivotal role in improving the lives of working people, championing in particular the rights of women and children across Glasgow. Presiding Officer, the case for a permanent monument to commemorate the achievements of Mary-Barbour is compelling, As we move towards sourcing funding for our monument, we must remember not only the significance of this for Govan, Glasgow, and the legacy of Mary-Barbour, it is significant in highlighting the wider absence of memorials to historically significant women. The excellent work of the Mapping Memorials to Women in Scotland project serves to help address this. Developed by Women's History Scotland, the Glasgow Women's Library and Girl Guiding Scotland, this project has helped map out locations of memorials to women throughout Scotland. It is projects like these, which I know have received a message of support from the First Minister last year. They are vital in ensuring the contributions of women throughout history are not overlooked. Our campaign has relied on the hard work of many people. Of course, some deserve a special mention. And now I would like to take that opportunity to thank them. Maria Fyfe, who chairs the Remember Mary-Barbour Committee, has worked tirelessly to raise the profile of this campaign and sends her sincere apologies for her unavoidable absence today. Cathy Jamieson MP, Mary Lockhart, who has also worked incredibly hard within the cooperative movement. Caroline Wilson from Glasgow Evening Times for her huge commitment and passion for the campaign. And Sharon Thomas, the artist who had been commissioned for a unique portrait of Mary-Barbour. Elaine Dougal, Unite the Union, STUC, Women's Committee, Glasgow Labour Women's Forum, Glasgow City Councillors, thank you to you all. And thank you to the countless others who have joined us along the way. Presiding Officer, I hope that this debate will encourage greater awareness of the life and achievements of Mary-Barbour, and I would once again like to thank all those who have worked so hard to bring about a permanent and lasting reminder of Glasgow's true heroine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now turn to the open part of the debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. And I call Ruth Davidson to be followed by Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I congratulate the member on securing this debate. And as the participants of it are acutely aware, Glasgow has an honourable tradition of electing Gobby women. Mary-Barbour, I believe, is at the root of that tradition, and yet her contribution to the lives of the people of Glasgow has had insufficient recognition until this point. So I am very happy to be able to welcome Glasgow City Council's decision to approve a statue of Mary-Barbour, and I hope that it will find a place in George Square with some of Glasgow's other notable monuments. As we've heard, or as we all know, those of us who are from the city, Glasgow only has 3 named women who are currently commemorated by statues. Queen Victoria, Dolores Ibárruru, known as La Pasionara, a prominent communist leader in the Spanish Civil War, and Lady Isabella Elder, who created Elder Park in memory of her husband, and the only local woman to make the grade. Until now, Glasgow has rather neglected its famous women, but a statue to Mary-Barbour is a starting point to remedying that neglect. It might seem strange to hear a Conservative leader arguing for such recognition for a Labour figure, but I think that Mary-Barbour's achievements were substantial, and I think it benefits public life in Scotland if we can acknowledge party political differences, but still make a neutral assessment of impact and standing. It doesn't do anyone any favours if we retreat to the kind of schoolyard politics which says we'll try and block opponents from the very legitimate pursuit of saying, here's someone who made a difference, who fought for their beliefs and who changed the face of the country, and that we block it for no other reason simply than because it's proposed by an opponent. So that's why I'm happy to say that Mary-Barbour was no ordinary politician, that she was a campaigning force of nature, that forcing a change in the law to stop ordinary people from being exploited by private landlords during the First World War, therefore protecting vulnerable families from war profiteers, is a significant achievement and that it deserves to be acknowledged. And as we've heard, she didn't stop there. She went on to become Glasgow's first female Labour councillor. Her association with organisations like the Glasgow Women's Housing Association were established to fight the rent rises cynically brought in while Glasgow's menfolk were at the front. And Mrs Barbour was so involved in the resistance against the evictions that her followers became known as Mrs Barbour's Army. It is staggering to think that she could attract 20,000 people onto the streets of Glasgow in November 1915 in demonstration of this cause. The Rent Restriction Act, which was passed shortly after, brought order to a chaotic housing system, and it protected thousands from unfair eviction. And clearly, given the times, it was in everybody's interest to prevent civil unrest. And so Mary's actions not only helped ordinary people, but they also contributed to the war effort. We've heard from the member of Mary's other political successes in helping to found the Women's Peace Crusade, elected to the Town Council as the first female Labour councillor, and later as the corporation's first female baillie and as one of the city's first female magistrates. Out of her wide campaigning issues, the introduction of municipal banks of washhouses, laundries and baths, a milk supply free to all schoolchildren, child welfare centres and play areas, home helps, pensions for mothers. For me, I think her most progressive was her commitment to, and indeed chairmanship of, the Women's Welfare and Advisory Clinic, Glasgow's first family planning centre. It showed her to be brave in the face of controversy and to not be afraid to be bold and challenging if she thought that it was the right thing to do. She loved the city of Glasgow, but knew that many of its poorer citizens had never seen beyond its boundaries. So in her later years, she helped set up and organise seaside outings for the children of disadvantaged families. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, I may have very different politics to Mary-Barbour, but I recognise in her a courageous, compassionate and campaigning woman, a woman set on improving her city and the lives of its people. Glasgow celebrates plenty of its famous sons, and I think it's time we celebrated the accomplishment of our daughters too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Sandra White.
Presiding Officer, and may I begin my contribution to this debate by congratulating my friend and colleague Anne McTaggart on securing it, and my friend and former colleague Maria Fyfe on the initiative which she is pursuing with her usual determination and drive, and which I am sure will ultimately result in a statue to Mary-Barbour being erected, hopefully in good time for the centenary of the rent strike, for which she is perhaps best known. Mary-Barbour, together with her contemporaries Agnes Dolan, Jessie Stevens and Helen Crawford, made an impact on my city and our country that can be felt to this day. For without them, municipal housing, or social housing as we now call it, might never have come to pass. Indeed, one of their key demands was that there should be a system of municipal housing to prevent the exploitation of working people in the housing market. So generations of tenants have them to thank for the housing that followed as a result of their campaigning, and they would, quite frankly, be turning in their graves if echoes of the bedroom tax were ever to reach them. Before the First World War, rents in Glasgow were low, but with the arrival of war and the need to staff the munitions factories on the Clyde, unscrupulous landlords thought that they could raise rents with impunity. However, they had not reckoned on Mrs Barbour and the women of Govan. In a short period of time, strikes and protests had spread to areas throughout the city, with estimates of the number of households taking action being anything up to 30,000, in the end forcing, as we've heard, the government to rush through the Rent Restriction Act of 1915. So the legacy of Mary-Barbour can be seen in legislation and in social change, and, as we've heard, in the many causes she championed as the first woman councillor in Glasgow. But that isn't all that she and her generation achieved. When I first joined the Labour Party, I was enthralled by stories told by two of the older members of our local branch, Margaret Young and Jenny Auld. They were children when Mrs Barbour was active, and Margaret Young could remember the rent strikes in Partick, where she grew up. She spoke vividly of her mother's involvement in them, and she also remembered being sent up closes to deliver ILP literature at election times, as it was not unknown for ILP activists who ventured into certain streets in Partick to be physically attacked, whereas children were regarded as being safe. Jenny Auld grew up in Lanarkshire and was in service as a young woman. When she defied her employer by leaving the big house to go out to use her first vote for the Labour candidate in an election, she returned to her place of work, knowing that she would have lost her job, but found that in addition, all her belongings had been thrown from a window into the muddy street. That generation of women were inspired by Mary-Barbour and grew up as the inheritors of her socialist principles, her steel and her resolve. Presiding Officer, as has been noted, there are currently only 3 statues to women in Glasgow, and while I would be the first to say that the wit and the wisdom of the late Bud Neal deserves to be commemorated, isn't it an irony that we had a statue to Lobie Dosser, a fictional cartoon character, some 30 years before we are likely to have one in Mary Barbour's name. Presiding Officer, there is an episode of that excellent political drama, The West Wing, where President Bartlett is surprised that the First Lady went all the way to Pennsylvania to dedicate a statue to Nellie Bly, the real-life pioneering investigative journalist. However, after being upbraided by Mrs Bartlett, the episode ends with the President dedicating his Saturday morning radio address to the issue of influential women being recognised by their country. He tells his listeners that it isn't good enough that there are only 50 statues in America dedicated to influential women, and that he will try to do something about it. And the West Wing scriptwriters were right when they had President Bartlett say that women such as Nellie Bly open a door to the world for all our daughters. Well, Mary Barbour opened that door to so many of the women who came after her and improved the lot of her fellow Glaswegians in doing so. She deserves to be remembered.
Thank you. I now call Sandra White to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate Anne McTaggart for securing this debate? And I'm reminded in the week when we had a debate about science, and all the remarks and the comments in that debate was in regards to encouraging more women to be involved in science. I think it's very apt that today we are actually debating the very positive and strong impact women have in their communities, but obviously in society and beyond that as well. And I do echo Patricia Ferguson's remarks in regards to the bedroom tax. Perhaps it also is a very apt debate to have at the moment when we're talking about the bedroom tax, and perhaps their aspirations will go further, and who knows what will happen with all of us here today in regards to the bedroom tax and what we do against it. Now, Presiding Officer, as someone who has been born and bred in Govan and grew up with the story of Mary Barbour, whose relatives worked in Fairfield shipyards and obviously stayed in this the Fairfield community, as it was called there, my recollections of particularly my great auntie Bessie, a great storyteller, and it wasn't a story, it was absolute truth, passing through the ages about Mary Barbour and the other ladies involved, ordinary housewives, children, as well as already has been said. In regards to the rent strike, it was absolutely fantastic and certainly an inspiration to us all. In fact, I remember a number of years ago when my aunt and my mother were elderly, taking them along to the Pearce Institute in Govan to listen to Alice Sheridan, basically giving a talk for the Govan Reminiscence Society, giving a talk of the rent strike and also the very strong women who were involved in that, not just in Govan obviously, but in Partick as well. And certainly it's been on, and absolutely correct when you look at the motion that we have these inspirational women, but we have nothing to commemorate them with, whether it be a monument, a statue, whatever it may be. It's a must that we must do that. And I think, as has already been said by Ruth Davison, regardless of the politics of anyone, basically it's something we should all be together on to commemorate and celebrate the very strong women within our society. Now, the one thing I would say about this debate is this theme running through it is basically strong and inspirational women. And certainly I know that the inspiration from yourselves has been through Mary Barbour and the Independent Labour Party as well. But if you could let me indulge myself in my own party, where my inspirations came from, is Wendy Woods was certainly my inspiration. Now, Wendy probably wasn't the most popular throughout. She incurred the wrath of both Westminster and obviously her own party, which was called the Scottish National Movement at that time. And I'm not saying I'm deliberately like Wendy Woods, but certainly I admired her stance in very many things. And I just want to give you two wee snippets of part of Wendy's life. Wendy had 2 spells in prison. Her first spell was in Sawton Prison in Edinburgh, when she attempted to disrupt the meeting of the Black Shirts in the Mound in Edinburgh. She was arrested and on breach of the peace. Her second time in prison was because she was demonstrating against the conditions of the women's prisons in Scotland, and she was in prison for that also. Once she left prison, she set to work with the commissioners of the prison, and she eventually got a letter saying that Duke Street Prison was to be demolished and that a new women's prison was to be built at Greenock. So these were my inspirations, as well as Mary Barbour and what was told by my aunt also. And I must say, I think that, yes, we have great women in this society. Do we honour them properly? No, I don't think so. But this is where perhaps I diversify from what Ruth Davidson was saying in regards to a monument or a statue in George Square. Well, as a Governite, I think you probably expect that I would be looking for some form of monument, whatever it may be, to be in Govan. It doesn't have to be in Elder Park, but somewhere where it actually the whole thing kicked off and the whole thing started. For me, that would be a commemoration. But certainly, you know, Maria Fyfe and others, it will be up to them and the working party where it goes. But as a Governor, I would like to see something commemorate Mary-Barbour and the very many women there in the Govan area. And thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Hanzala Malik to be followed by Hugh Henry.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and good afternoon. I'm really privileged to take part in today's debate, and I would like to thank Anne McTaggart for securing today's debate. Thank you very much, Anne, for that. Mary-Barbour was born in 1875. She was one of 7 children, and her father was a carpet weaver. The year 1896 saw her marry David Barbour and settled in the Govan borough of Glasgow. She joined and became an active member of the Kinning Park Cooperative Guild, the first to be established in Scotland. So that in itself is impressive. Mary joined an independent Labour Party and the Socialist Sunday School, and during the Glasgow rent increases in the First World War brought her to the forefront of local political activity. To establish the Glasgow Women Housing Association, which was born in 1914 and was in Govan, also my birthplace. So, like Sandra White, I was also born in Govan. It's a very special place, Govan, actually. I thought I'd just add that in for good measure. Therefore, I think that it's important that we recognise the incredible appreciation that one needs to have for women, not only now, but in that era, who faced up to huge challenges. Mary, as a working-class housewife with 2 children and a husband, she was well qualified to be engaged in many of the activities which soon spread to the whole of Clydebank area. In 1915, one of the largest demonstrations in Glasgow's political history, thousands of women marched through with thousands of shipyard engineers in the streets of Glasgow. And as a result of that, Rent Registration Act heralded a change in housing systems for the city of Glasgow. And I think that also progressed throughout the United Kingdom thereafter. And as Patricia Ferguson mentioned, Maria Fyfe, and I think Anne, you also mentioned Maria Fyfe. Maria Fyfe was also quite a hero for me as well. I learned a lot of challenge that she as a woman faced. And I go on to say that as a first councillor, Mary as a first councillor for the Labour Party, elected to Glasgow Town Council then in Govan, and during her term as a Labour councillor, she fought for a range of policies, pushing for coverage and activities, amongst them such as things as wash houses, laundriettes, public baths, free milk to school children. May I add, I'm old enough to actually benefited from that myself. And going further in terms of school children welfare, play areas, pensions for mothers, home help, and local banks. As a first woman Bailey in the year 1924 to 1927, saw her serve the Glasgow Corporation's first woman Bailey. I can say I can relate to this as my wife Halima Malik was also one of the first Pakistani women to be elected to Glasgow City Council, and she also served as a Bailey of the city. And I recall the challenges that she faced, and believe you me, there were some challenges. And if my wife can face those challenges in this day and age, I can't imagine the challenges Mary had to face. So I have a lot of respect for the lady for having achieved so much that she did. So, in terms of the fact that she passed away in 2nd of April 1958, I really think that she deserves more respect from the city that we have given her to date. And I have absolutely no hesitation in supporting your bid in terms of having some sort of memorial for Mary, and therefore I commend your debate, and I also personally appeal to Glasgow City Council also to consider this, because I think what you suggest is a wonderful idea. Thank you for bringing it to this debate today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now call Hugh Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank Anne McTaggart for giving this Parliament the opportunity to actually put on record our appreciation of the contribution that Mary-Barbour, and indeed the generation that Mary-Barbour came from, the contribution that they made to Scottish society, and indeed to actually recognise that without the efforts of people like Mary-Barbour, we wouldn't be sitting in this place today. Because not only was it Mary-Barbour's generation that ensured that women got the vote, it was Mary-Barbour's generation that actually proved that women could play an active and useful role in politics. And without the lead taken by Mary-Barbour and her generation, working women would not have made the advances that they did, but indeed working men would not have made the advances that they did. Because Mary-Barbour and the people around her at that time were a product of their generation. They were impelled into political activity because of the injustice and unfairness that surrounded them in society. And I think it's right that we mark the contribution that those pioneers made, because we have so much to be thankful for. We have our opportunity to engage in democratic politics by being in places like the Scottish Parliament or the City Council. But actually, we owe our education to that generation. We owe our health service to the efforts of that generation. We owe decent housing conditions to the efforts of that generation. And more significantly, we owe the fact that workers can be treated fairly in factories and offices in this country to that generation that struggled so much. But I also want to put on record not just the contribution that Mary and people from Govan and Glasgow made, because Mary was a product of Renfrewshire, which I represent. Now, like Hanzala Malik and Sandra White, I too was born in Govan. But Mary-Barbour's formative years, as Anne McTaggart has said, were actually in Renfrewshire, in Kilbarchan and in Eldersley, and she actually married David Barbour, as others have said, who came from Johnson. And Kilbarchan was a hotbed of political radicalism. It was the home of radical, educated weavers who fought for democratic rights and who fought for workers' rights as well. And they were hugely political, and clearly that influenced Mary. She then moved to Eldersley and worked in Sturrock's carpet factory in Eldersley, and again a community with strong industrial trade union roots. And you can imagine when she moved from that political environment that she grew up in into the hotbed of political radicalism in Govan, where the injustice and the poverty was stark, what that then meant. And she had the confidence from her upbringing to be able then to take that a step further. So I am delighted not only that Maria Fyfe and others in Glasgow are doing so much to mark Mary-Barbour's contribution to society, but also to pay tribute to my colleagues, Councillor Derek Bibby and Councillor Chris Gilmer in Renfrewshire, who want to see Kilbarchan actually mark the contribution that Mary-Barbour has made to Scottish society. She was a product of Kilbarchan, as I said, but she made her mark in Govan. But the whole of Scotland benefited from her activities. But do you know, the worst thing that we could do is to say that all we need to do to commemorate Mary-Barbour is to stick up a statue and the job is done. Because actually it's what Mary-Barbour stood for that's significant. And Mary-Barbour stood against injustice and she stood against exploitation. And where there is injustice and exploitation, then the need for Mary-Barbers of today is more relevant than ever. So when we have injustices, as Patricia Ferguson and others have said, like the bedroom tax, then the present generation of Mary-Barbers need to come forward and say that we are standing against it. But when we see tragedies like the ones that we saw in Bangladesh, where women workers and child workers were killed because of poor working conditions, then we can say that Mary-Barbour's work is not finished. And the best tribute that we can make to Mary-Barbour is not just to mark her contribution with a statue, but to say that her work goes on and it will not finish until we see fairness and justice across this world.
Thank you very much. I now invite Margaret Burgess to respond to the debate. Minister, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd also like to thank Anne McTaggart for bringing this debate to the Chamber. I think it's always important to recognise the pioneering women who took these vital steps in politics on behalf of us all, who have now followed on since. And I think it's right, it's stretching out with Glasgow and Govan to other parts of Scotland. I mean, I would imagine when Mary first became the first female councillor in Glasgow in 1920, she would have thought that gender equality in public and political life would be secured by now. But almost 100 years later, that's not yet the case. While the gender balance in this Parliament is considerably better than at Westminster, we are still making headway with public appointments, but there's still a lot more for us to do. And there's little doubt that Mary-Barbour's passion and success in driving forward policies to improve the lives of many of the poorest people in our society, as Hugh Henry has said, has helped shape the country we live in today. And although we've come a long way since then, we can still draw on her for inspiration to deliver our aim to create a fairer and more equal country. The Scottish Government's commitment to reduce inequalities is echoed in the National Performance Framework, Solidarity and Cohesion targets, as well as through our commitment to the principle of universal entitlement, which I firmly believe maintains a sense of togetherness that should be the cornerstone of any society, and the one of which Mary-Barbour was so proud of. For example, through our child poverty strategy for Scotland, we express our commitment to focus on the need to tackle the long-term drivers of poverty through early intervention and prevention in order to break the cycles of poor outcomes. And that's something I think Mary would approve of. But despite all of what we try to do, we continue to see our social policies being undermined by the welfare reforms being introduced at Westminster. And I think a few of the speakers have mentioned that. And I just wonder what Mary-Barbour would have thought of something as unfair as the bedroom tax, and would she ever have envisaged that 100 years on, that something like that would happen at this stage. So over the 5 years to 2015, Scotland is going to see £4.5 billion taken from hard workers and low incomes, from families, from those with disability and from social housing tenants. In other words, precisely the very people that society should be helping and not harming, protecting, not pillaging, the people Mary cared so passionately about and so worked hard to improve their lives. Whether the changes introduced by the UK Government last year to tax credits, which have been hitting the budget of over 100,000 working families in Scotland, or the fundamental changes to child benefit, there is no longer a universal bond from one generation to the next, just a muddle of unfairness. The sad reality is that reducing the value of tax credits and child benefits will result in a lower income for those with caring responsibilities, the vast majority of whom are women. And again, 100 years ago, that was very much what Mary-Barbour fought to improve. And like Mary-Barbour, this Government remains dedicated to supporting those who care for children through measures such as increasing the amount and flexible delivery of free early learning and childcare from 475 hours to a minimum of 600 hours a year. And this action will improve outcomes for children and also support women in Scotland into work. Issues hindering women's access and participation in employment are a key priority for us. Through working closely with the STUC, we held the first ever Scottish Women's Employment Summit in 2012 to consider these issues and identify actions to tackle them. Measures like this will provide tangible benefits for women and families across Scotland. And like Mary-Barbour, I too recognise the vital role of social housing in providing people with an affordable home and a platform for getting on in life, and also to deliver a community that people wanted to live in. And I think one of the things we've heard from Mary-Barbour, her community spirit, her working for her community to keep the community together, and that to me is absolutely a significant part of what she did. Mary fought so very hard for the hardest hit. And I wonder, as I said earlier, what she would think about this one-size-for-all bedroom tax that doesn't matter about age, disability, availability of smaller houses or economic conditions, that the poorest are going to be hit the hardest. The UK Government's reforms call into question the role of housing support in a civilised country. Access to decent housing is a fundamental need and right, and something that Mary-Barbour recognised 100 years ago. And I'm sure she'd be pleased to see that this Scottish Government, what it's doing to try and address that. The challenge facing the social housing sector in particular is the reason why we've given money to social landlords to help advise their tenants. But this will carry on, and many impacts of the UK Government's welfare reforms go beyond what we currently have the powers to do in our own country. And it saddens me that the reforms they have chosen to introduce go against the vision that people like Mary-Barbour had for this country. I passionately believe the best solution can be found by the Scottish people having control over such matters. We must ensure that no one is held back because of discrimination or disadvantage. But until then, this Government will continue to act and intervene where we have the powers to do so. And Mary-Barbour has been said was an inspirational woman, and a monument is a fitting tribute to her. Yes, I will.
Tricia Ferguson.
And its ministers are so firmly behind Mary-Barbour as an inspirational figure. I wonder if they would be willing, therefore, to make a contribution towards the commemoration of Mary-Barbour.
Minister.
I think that's something I'll certainly take back and look at this stage. I can't comment on that, but I certainly would say that she was an inspirational woman, and a monument is a fitting tribute to her. I certainly, having heard, I have no connections with Govan or Kilbarchan or anywhere, but we could maybe stretch it down to Ayrshire a bit. But I would certainly say that Maria's Fyfe and her group, I wish them every success in their fundraising effort, and I'm certainly glad that I won't have any say in where the monument, any monument, if it's agreed, is placed. But I think it is a very fitting tribute for a woman who has done so much for Glasgow and for women in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes Anne McTaggart's members' business debate, Mary-Barbour Commemoration, and I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30 p.m.